Welcome to the Placement Office's FYI Breakfast Series. This morning I'm very pleased to introduce to you Shannon Burchett. Shannon is a distinguished alumnus of the Freeman School. I probably shouldn't say of the Freeman School because it wasn't called the Freeman School when he graduated. So he's a distinguished alumnus of the Tulane School of Business. He got his MBA in 1976 and from there went on to work for Union Carbide in New York, managing international investment portfolios and currency protection programs. From there, he went on to Bankers Trust as the Assistant Vice President in the World Corporate Department. And from there, he became the Director of International Finance for Aetna Life and Casualty Company. From there, Shannon went on to Pepsi-Cola, where he is now the Vice President at Pepsi-Cola Sweeteners in New York. His specialty is risk management, including hedging strategies, international funding strategies, and financial programs. Shannon has also published numerous articles in financial magazines and also a book chapter, and I think if you picked up the packet as you came in, you'll have a chance to read all of that. And he's an adjunct professor of finance at NYU and Pace University. Most important, though, Shannon is a very active member of our Career Consultants Network, and I'm sure that some of you have already had the benefit of talking to him. If you haven't, I'll make an invitation now. Please take advantage of him. He's been very helpful to many of our students and alums over the years. So now I'd like to introduce you to Shannon Burchett, and he's going to give you his insights on the job search and career strategies.
Thanks. It's good to be back to New Orleans and to Tulane again. And as Lisa's saying, my background really isn't human resources or personnel or such, but rather is more in finance. But I thought this morning would be an occasion to sort of share with you some of the ideas I have about job search and what might benefit you in terms of your strategies as you graduate looking for a career position. And some of it, I'll just start with some basic ideas in terms of my views on some of the do's and don'ts, and then after a period of time, if there are any questions, or we can have some discussion about some of your strategies, and we can share some ideas there. But from my vantage point, the career search or any job search, whether it's right out of Tulane or subsequently job moves, and I view it as somewhat of a marketing program. And it's just, you happen to be the product happens to be yourself, but I think some of the things you were in marketing a particular product or service, some of the things you'd be doing there are probably going to be the same sort of strategies you'd want to use in marketing yourself, as opposed to some kind of ad hoc program. In my view, finding a job, whether it's the first one or subsequent position, is going to be a full-time job in itself. I mean, right now, your first, most important activity, no doubt's doing well and finishing at Tulane. But I think the close second to that, since what your education is all about finding the right career, I mean, aside from the general aspect of gaining knowledge and the enhancement there, I mean, it is, in my view, somewhat of an objective toward finding the right career position. So all that to say, I think your time is well spent toward anything you can do to bolster your position as you go into the job market. So with that in mind, first, let me ask you, how many of you are going to be graduating within a year? Everyone, so you're going to be in the job market soon. So I think whether you still have enough time to prepare for the right side of job search. I mean, and we'll talk about what some of the specifics might be. But first of all, you probably already all have a resume. If you don't, I think you need to draft one. And if nothing else, it's sort of a starting point to give you a perception of where your credentials stack up and where your areas for opportunities for improvement may be. So to some of the specifics in my view on the resumes, and this is one person's view. I mean, there are different host of different ways to look at what should be in your resume package and in your mass marketing cover letter and so on and so on. But I think there are some specifics that are probably going to be universally true. On your resume, I don't think that's going to be the time to be modest. I mean, no lies in the resume I wouldn't recommend. Generally, those are going to be found out. But I think things need to be presented as creatively and as directly as possible. We were talking about some of the specifics that one may want to put in a resume, and some in a resume, and what typically is asked about. How many put your GPA in your resume? Is that an issue? Okay. Well, from my standpoint, I think it's certainly no harm to do that, particularly if you have a high GPA, certainly put it in. Some other points of questions have come up from time to time when I've talked with Tulane students. What about personal interest? Should you have some kind of category of hobbies or others listing of personal interest? I would say it probably doesn't matter a lot, provided you don't make it into a negative. I mean, there's some, and I look back through some previous resumes I've gotten, not from Tulane students, but rather just resumes that have come across my desk. And looking at that category, I saw some that I viewed as sort of negative items, or a little bizarre in terms of what they meant. Here are a few of my favorites. One was personal interest, law enforcement. I'm not sure what that meant. It was the next Charles Bronson or what. But another one was weightlifting, and this was on a woman's resume, which is fine. I think everyone needs to be in physical shape. But another was wrestling. So none of these are negatives in themselves, but I'd say if you're going to list personal interest, I'd keep them on a positive, right image sort of standpoint. And looking through previous resumes, I saw one I thought illustrated used that category to make the right point. This person had a very extensive international background, and they had listed that they were a U.S. permanent resident. And I think that conveyed some information as opposed to sort of general nebulous things. Another was listed as personal interest was family. I don't know if there was a message there that the person wasn't going to work 15 hours a day or whatever, but which might have been appropriate since it was a resume submitted to Pepsi. But other questions in terms of what you may want to put on your resume, and again, just one person's opinion, but what about a list of references? And I've seen a few of those on the resume. In my opinion, I would say absolutely not. If you're to the point where the employer is going to want to see your resume, I think they'll ask. I mean, if you have a resume list that includes George Bush or something, or some other notable, maybe then it's impressive enough you attach it. But I think generally that can be left to a later point. What about the putting an objective statement? Does everyone have one of those on your resume? I think generally I see those as something particularly for our initial job search coming out of Tulane. I think it's helpful to state what the objective is. I mean, granted, in the cover letter could be used to describe that also, but I think for your first position, you're going to want to have some kind of description of what your objective is. 10 to 15 years from now, I think your resume probably in itself will tell what the objective is by your career track. Okay. Another question I've seen come up in terms of resume for first position, seeking the first position. What about having your home address and your school address, if those happen to be different if you're not from New Orleans? I would say generally that's, I don't know that it matters a great deal, but you definitely want to have some phone number on the resume where you can be reached. I think nothing could work to your detriment, and more so than having a number. If you put your home phone number at your permanent home address and phone number, and the phone is not going to be answered during the day or something of that nature. So then that to say the obvious. Another one, what about having a photograph with your resume? I'd say probably not, unless you're going into modeling or something of that nature. How long should your resume be? In my opinion, I'd say you should be able to get everything on one page. If you can't, you must have had some very significant accomplishments. But for now, I'd say 1 page maximum. And again, 10 to 15 years from now, it's probably going to perhaps take 2 pages to give some details to what you've been involved in. Above all, I would say in drafting or redrafting or preparing your resume before you begin your job search as you approach graduation, have someone proofread your resume, someone whose opinion you respect somewhat in terms of their familiarity with what should be there. Obviously, it should be totally error-free. I think you do yourself a little disservice from a format standpoint if everything's not somewhat letter perfect. accompanying that, provided you take the approach of having a mass marketing campaign, approaching a number of companies through a mass mailing sort of approach, is a question of the cover letters. And all of this, we're starting very much from the basics. Some of this may be bridges that you've already crossed, but I want to, just having seen what at times are mistakes, in my view, that are made by job candidates, let me talk with you about the cover letter. I mean, first of all, I think it has to be first class. And by that, I mean format and first class stationery. I happened to, yesterday, and just ironically in terms of the timing, received a resume from, it was a son of someone I know in New York City, and I think the person is very qualified. From the University of Chicago, some international experience, looking for a position with in India, because the person speaks Hindi and is, I think, really had the credentials, but the person's cover letter, I think, connoted the wrong thing to Pepsi. I mean, I think from the employer is going to look at it not just in terms of what information is on the resume, but how astute one is at presenting themselves. If one can't present themselves, market themselves appropriately in their job search, the question is going to be how would they represent the company. So then this person, I think, is going to have the credentials, but probably sells themselves short. So the thing I would say to you, you need a first-class package, cover letter and resume, if you're going to be doing any kind of direct mail campaign. And to support that, I think you're going to want to have access to a word processor, which I presume is the case here if you don't have your own word processor, as opposed to tapping out X number of resumes, X number of cover letters. In terms of the cover letter, I would say you want to make it very direct. You probably only get 10 to 30 seconds in terms of the first scan by the employer. So I'd keep the resume, or rather the cover letter, relatively direct, one page, right to the point. And again, no glaring errors, no typos, mistakes, or those sort of things. All these very basic, but if you don't get the basics right, I think you're probably in trouble on your job search. In terms of the overall strategy of what routes you're going to take to try to make sure you explore all the right opportunities, I think your first best bet is going to be the placement office. When I was at Tulane, as Lisa described, my first position out of Tulane was with Union Carbide, and I was recruited for that position from your own campus. That's probably your best bet, but perhaps you don't want to rely on that totally. What are the other things you could be doing? Well, we already talked about a mass mail campaign, directly sending your resume with a cover letter directly to companies that fit the profile of where you want to be and the industries you want to be. And there are a lot of sources that you can use for identifying names of companies. There's always newspaper ads, but I don't think one wants to rely totally on that. There are corporate directories which will be available here in the placement office or in the library, which, if any of you are interested, I can list some of those for you in more detail after the session here. But I mean, there are directories of companies like Dun & Bradstreet, the Directory of Corporate Affiliations, the Corporate Blue Book, so on and so on. And there's also the question of whether one should use what I'll call headhunters, executive recruiters, or contingency recruiters. My impression is, for the first position out of Tulane, unless you have some exceptional background and work experience, that probably isn't, you certainly don't want to rely on that, and it's probably not one of the major alternatives for locating a position. Your second and third move, I think that's going to be the primary avenue, using headhunters. But to the extent that you want to send your resume and to selected recruiters, and I don't mean corporate recruiters, but rather executive search firms, there are a whole host of directories available that list those. The so-called Red Book, which lists all the directory of executive recruiters and others. Other potential sources for information. If you're at your local bookstore, you're going to see a whole host of books on the subject of job hunting, networking, interviewing, dress for success, whatever. So I think there's no shortage of general reference material to assist you in information
in preparing for your job search.